Hello, kia ora, and thank you for being here now. I am Mitchell Head from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and today I will share how I found a fascinating connection between anesthetics, racing cars, and crystal radios. See, I grew up in an engineering family playing with crystal radios, magnets, and racing cars with Toyota. While racing, I noticed that we would measure and optimize the car, but not the human brain driving it. While we had temperature sensors on every cylinder and analyzed every suspension movement in an effort to gain 1/10 of a second, we still resorted to the superstition of wearing lucky underwear to optimize the driver. Some days the driver would be in the zone. I could put the car exactly where I wanted and felt at one with the car, even having an out-of-body experience where I was viewing the track marker from the perspective of the car's front bumper. However, on other days the driver would be completely off, and thousands spent to monitor and optimize the car machine were wasted, as the driver was not being monitored and optimized, and had a far greater impact on the car's performance. I realized then that if we could measure and optimize the brain, we could induce peak performance and happiness for people to do whatever they are most passionate about and best solve the world's problems. From this point, I switched from studying engineering to neuroscience with the goal to monitor and facilitate optimum performance. I soon began to ask questions about anesthesia, and I was shocked to hear that we did not understand exactly how anesthetics work to temporarily inhibit our very experience of reality. If we could understand how these molecules turn off consciousness, we could reverse engineer this mechanism to increase or alter consciousness for peak performance. I soon found a project related to anesthetics, aiming to optimize the effects of ketamine anesthesia for surgical use. See, anesthesia describes a range of effects, and the problem here was that ketamine use as a clinical anesthetic in surgery produces long periods of unwanted hypnotic effects, persisting after the pain relief or analgesia has worn off. This can develop into agitation, disorientation, hallucinations, and nausea for the patient upon emergence from surgery, and this limits the usability in a clinical setting. Indeed, field reports show that clinical use is often curtailed by unwanted psychomimetic effects, thought to be mediated by NMDA receptor antagonism. Thus, modifications that maintain analgesia while reducing the period of sedation would be advantageous in this setting. Ketamine analogues were therefore developed by our collaborators for rapid offset of hypnosis by hydrolysis-mediated breakdown. We then tested the effects in Sprague-Dawley rat animal models and analyzed behavioral measures of analgesia and sedation. The amount of time taken to remove the tail from the heat lamp, or tail flick latency, was measured for analgesia. And the time taken to be able to stand after administration, or return of writing reflex, was measured for sedation. Molecular analysis further used immunostaining for the measurement of brain activation patterns. Our results can be described as 3 A's of anesthesia: analgesia, arousal, and activation. Our behavioral results on analgesia measured tail flick latency and found that the novel analog indeed produced an extended duration of analgesic effects when compared to ketamine. While the ketamine group's analgesic responses returned to baseline after 20 minutes, the novel analog produced analgesia of stronger potency and which persists for twice the duration, beyond 40 minutes after infusion. This analog therefore produces a 100% increase in the duration of analgesia. Behavioral results on sedation measured the amount of time to return of writing reflex, and found that the novel analogs significantly reduced the duration of the hypnotic period when compared to ketamine. While ketamine produces a hypnotic period of 600 seconds after administration, novel analogs produced a more than 6-fold decrease in this duration of hypnotic period. This indicates a very advantageous pharmacological profile for use in surgical settings. From here, we wanted to better understand the molecular mechanisms of these effects, and employed immunohistochemical staining of brain samples to examine if the different responses are reflected by an altered pattern of neuronal activation in regions associated with analgesia and sedation. As we can see here, different treatment groups show different levels of staining and therefore brain activation in different regions. This activation was analyzed and compared between treatment groups. Most interestingly, activation of one brain region in particular correlates precisely with the drug's hypnotic period length. Activation of the supraoptic nucleus correlates with the duration of hypnotic period, with novel analogues producing significantly reduced activity of this brain region when compared to ketamine. So could this change in brain activity underlie the observed changes and behavioral effects of these drugs? A recent study published in the journal Neuron shows very comprehensive evidence that may support this idea. Zhang Ji et al. Show a population of anesthesia-activated neurons located in the supraoptic nucleus that are stimulated by ketamine and other anesthetics, resulting in slow-wave sleep. They further show how inhibition of these neurons in the SON shortens the period of sedation. They conclude that maintenance of sedation may therefore be modulated by the largely neuroendocrine functions of these neurons, including the release of oxytocin and vasopressin to relax the peripheral system. Taken together, these findings suggest that our novel ketamine analogues indeed produce an advantageous pharmacological profile for clinical use. Ketamine analogues produced extended duration of analgesia and a reduced period of sedation when compared to ketamine. Analogues also showed significantly reduced activation of the SON, a population of neurons associated with the length of sedation, which may contribute to the mechanisms by which these drugs produce less sedation by reduced inhibitory endocrine response. So while these ketamine analogues were designed for rapid offset of hypnosis by hydrolysis-mediated breakdown, which aim to reduce the hypnotic effects proposed to be the result of NMDA receptor activation, another intriguing mechanism of action has also been proposed. Anesthetics have been suggested to bind to hydrophobic regions in the microtubule protein structures associated with memory. Decoherence of these structures is also associated with memory failure in Alzheimer's disease. Tazinski and Hameroff have developed models of anesthetic binding sites and suggested that this could be how anesthetics have their effect. Anesthetics may therefore uniquely disrupt the tubulin protein dipole alignment along the microtubule due to their charge and polarity properties. The Meyer-Overton correlation is one supporting piece of this puzzle for mechanism of action that we have empirical data for. This shows that the relative strength of an anesthetic to remove consciousness has a linear correlation with its solubility in oil. There is indeed oil-like hydrophobic regions in microtubules where these have been proposed to bind. It has been suggested that the tubulin dimers of microtubules switch polarity when conscious 40 times a second, and through this nested rhythm structure, we observe that the 40 Hz gamma frequency stops with anesthesia and loss of consciousness. Anesthetics, therefore, may block the dipole alignment necessary for the maintenance of a magnetic standing wave conducted through microtubules. This would integrate global brain activity instantaneously by longitudinal waves into a unified experience, and thus these drugs inhibit the experience of reality itself. This would mean that anesthesia somewhat disrupts the structure of the crystal radio in your head. We may therefore be able to stimulate these oscillations to alter and optimize conscious states, either through molecules which are made of aromatic ring structures, which act as a lens to amplify the electromagnetic signaling in microtubules, or via ultrasound stimulation to modulate these structures specifically. We can, in this way, tune our brains for optimum performance and happiness. Finally, thank you to our collaborators and affiliates, and to Drs. Stuart Hameroff and Jay Sanguinetti for this great opportunity and the inspiration to follow this dream. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Montjoy. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona's College of Nursing, and I'm also a board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner in private practice here in Tucson, Arizona. Today I'm going to be discussing inducing non-ordinary states of consciousness in psychiatry, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And so I hold a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of South Carolina, a Master of Science in Nursing from Vanderbilt University. And as I mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate. My substantive is Biobehavioral Neuroscience at the University of Arizona. I hold a national board certification in psychiatry, and I'm licensed to practice as a psychiatric nurse practitioner in the state of Arizona. I am also ACLS certified, and I have trained through the Ketamine Training Center and completed their ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training. Just a disclaimer, this presentation is informational. It's not intended as a substitute for medical or psychiatric advice or as a substitute for clinical judgment. If you or someone you love is severely depressed and or suicidal, please seek immediate mental health care. Local and national mental health resources can be found at NAMI.org, and the 24/7 National Suicide Prevention Line is 800-273-8255. As I mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate and the owner of an integrative psychiatric practice here in Tucson. I offer a variety of treatment modalities, including medication management, therapy, and biofeedback. I also offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I'm not affiliated with any pharmaceutical companies, and no patient data from my private practice will be used for the purposes of this presentation. A lake is the earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature. Henry Thoreau. And so why the resurgence of psychedelic and non-ordinary states of consciousness research in psychiatric conditions? Aside from the novelty, at least for most of us, why does this research matter in mental health care? This is going to be the focus of today's presentation, and how this research has begun to translate into psychiatric clinical practice will also be discussed. Star Trek, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Non-ordinary states of consciousness, where humankind has boldly journeyed for millennia. And we've done this with the assistance of plant medicines, but also with modalities such as meditation, drumming, breathwork, yoga, music, dance, and many other modalities. And so you may be asking, what does this have to do with mental health? Roughly 48 to 55% of patients suffering from major depressive disorder have co-occurring PTSD. And estimated treatment response is 50% for depression and 40% for PTSD, respectively. And so what that means is that 50% or more of patients seeking help for these conditions are not getting better. This is exemplified by unprecedented suicide mortality in the US, with 66,000 veterans dying from suicide since 2005. And more than 1,900 nurses and 350 physicians die each year from suicide. Lack of efficacious psychiatric treatment modalities has been an important catalyst for psychedelic and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy research. And so why are mental health care treatments not working for half or more of these patients suffering from depression or PTSD sequelae? One reason is a reductionist biomedical framework that's being applied to complex, holistic psychiatric conditions. Another reason is a symptom management approach to mental health care treatment. In other words, we're helping to reduce symptom severity, but we're not treating the underlying cause for the symptoms. And finally, in 40 years, we have not had any breakthroughs in psychotropic treatment modalities. We're still using the same monoamine hypothesis. Another important aspect contributing to the treatment, the lack of efficacy for more than half of patients suffering from depression and PTSD, is that our modalities are not taking into consideration consciousness and the existential implications of mental illness. And what I mean by that is the intrapersonal and transpersonal disconnect that's experienced by a lot of patients. Intrapersonal disconnect means a disconnect from oneself. It's often accompanied by a lack of compassion for oneself. And this translates into interpersonal disconnect with other people. Transpersonal disconnect is a disconnect beyond the human physicality. So a disconnect with Mother Earth, with nature, with the other organisms, animals that inhabit, and even with the universe or the cosmos. So it's a sense of alienation or isolation, both internally and outside of oneself. So these assertions are not revelatory. More than 50 years ago, Maslow recognized the importance of intrapersonal connection and the need for human beings to relate and connect transpersonally beyond the egoic self. However, the traditional biomedical model guiding research in mental health care continues to disregard these aspects of illness. And this consequently hinders healing and maintaining the Band-Aid approach that I mentioned of symptom management. And so it's time for a new paradigm in psychiatry and mental health care. Research and interventions need to confront the complex nature of disease, both psychological, physiological, and psychospiritual. We need research and interventions to target the underlying causes of psychopathology. The emphasis needs to shift from a symptom management approach to healing and transformation. So this is where ketamine comes into the picture. Just a little bit of background, ketamine is considered or classified as a dissociative. It's a Schedule III controlled substance in the US. It's been researched for mental health conditions for more than 30 years. It's been investigated for treatment-resistant depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and addiction. Ketamine has been found to be neurogenic and to moderate pro-inflammatory physiological states or biomarkers, such as cytokines and cortisol. Ketamine is commonly used as an anesthetic and analgesic in healthcare across the lifespan, so from pediatric to geriatric, and in veterinary medicine. And for some, it is a substance of misuse recreationally. Racemic ketamine is still considered off-label for use in psychiatric conditions per the FDA. And this is not to say it is legal, it's just considered off-label. So it's often not covered by insurance because of this designation. Ketamine is a molecule that has a novel psychotropic mechanism of action. And it's known to target N-methyl deaspartate or NMDA receptors. It's been found to be an NMDA antagonist. And these receptors are embedded in the glutamate matrix. Interestingly, aberrant glutamatergic activity has also been identified in persons with PTSD and complex PTSD. And so this is an important point because this is a deviation from the 40-year-old monoamine hypothesis or approach in terms of mechanism of action in treating psychiatric conditions. Ketamine is currently being provided for treatment of psychiatric conditions in ketamine infusion clinics that are managed by anesthesiologists and administered by non-mental health clinicians intravenously. And there is a growing subset of mental health clinicians that are providing therapeutic ketamine. However, this is the predominant setup or model that patients are receiving ketamine treatment. And ketamine is currently the only legal psychedelic available in the US for use in healthcare settings by licensed medical providers. However, whether there are therapeutic or psychological benefits in ketamine's use as a psychedelic continues to be debated, even within psychiatry. Is ketamine safe? So with any mind-altering molecule, ketamine potentiates a vulnerable state. And so it's important to work with trustworthy clinicians, ethical clinicians that understand and respect the effects of this molecule. Ideally with clinicians that have both medical and psychological training. Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy has been used safely in office settings for more than 5 years. And as I mentioned, it's been investigated in psychiatric settings and in research for more than 30 years. It's not a good choice for persons with history of uncontrolled hypertension, a history of cerebrovascular accident or stroke, cardiovascular disease, aneurysm, or a diagnosis of thought disorder, such as schizophrenia. And so why might induction of non-ordinary states of consciousness or psychedelic states with sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine be beneficial for treating mental illness in psychiatric settings? For one, safety. In these particular settings, this reduces the risk of re-traumatization by having trained mental health clinicians present. Much of the debate regarding the psychedelic effects of ketamine has been based on reported distress experienced by patients in hospital settings that have received ketamine for pre-procedurally. And in these scenarios, patients are not informed and thus not expecting the sensory alterations that commonly accompany subanesthetic ketamine administration. And this is why special attention and training for mental health clinicians that focus on safety, setting, and preparation for therapeutic ketamine use is critical. Psychiatric settings also provide a comfortable, warm, and therapeutic environment in contrast to a sterile or more medicalized infusion clinic environment. And these non-ordinary states provide an opportunity for concurrent psychotherapy, as with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. This can be especially helpful for patients who are stuck in a rigid egoic mindset, which may be hindering psychiatric treatment progress and consequently healing. In psychiatric settings, the intention is to facilitate an experience of unity and expansiveness and interpersonal and transpersonal reconnection, ideally self-transcendence. The experience of self-transcendence is dichotomous to the daily sense of isolation and alienation that's so prevalent. Hallmark symptoms of treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, among many other mental health conditions. And so tenets of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy are to promote contemplation, integration, and transformation, to provide a safe container and support when needed during sessions. The approach utilizes internal family systems, transpersonal and Jungian therapy. Another tenet is the respect for the higher wisdom or consciousness inherent in all human beings, this higher knowing. The psychedelic or non-ordinary state can be an invaluable opportunity for transformative healing as well. In terms of recently published ketamine-assisted psychotherapy outcome data, there was a paper published last year reporting on data collected from 2013 to 2018 from 3 clinical sites with 235 participants. And they reported decreased severity in anxiety and depression sequelae pre to post ketamine-assisted psychotherapy treatment, the greatest reduction of anxiety and depressive symptom severity was found in persons or reported by persons with a diagnosis of complex PTSD. Also, older participant age was correlated with the greatest depression improvement pre to post ketamine-assisted psychotherapy treatment. In closing, a singularly biomedical approach is not a conducive research design for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and psychedelic research. A mixed methods approach or research design with inclusion of self-transcendence measures will provide more informative and robust outcome data. Attention to treatment ecology, such as setting, clinicians' training, and methods around administration, for example, opening and closing of the session, and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy research and treatment is imperative. Longitudinal and protocol-guided therapeutic ketamine research are still needed. And so this research is ongoing. There are multiple studies, both clinical and in academic research settings that are currently underway. For questions or if you need to contact me, again, my name is Jennifer Montjoy. My email is jmontjoy@protonmail.com. You can also connect with me through my contact tab via my website, resiliencetucson.com. Thank you for your attention and have a great day.
All right, welcome to my talk for the Science of Consciousness online conference. I'll be discussing the differential effects of propofol and ketamine on neural state transition dynamics. Real fast about me. So I'm a dual PhD student at Indiana University at Bloomington, working on complex networks and systems and computational neuroscience. I'm interested in consciousness science writ large, anesthetics, disorders of consciousness, psychedelic science, as well as network science and complexity science, with a particular focus on information theory and ideas about behind emergence and self-organizations, all of which will come up in some capacity when I'm discussing the work that I'm presenting here. How is the talk going to be structured? I'll start by introducing the problem that we're trying to address, which is sort of point measures of consciousness versus a broader conception of state spaces. We'll talk about state spaces in a little more detail, and then I'll introduce the mathematical machinery that I'm using to answer these questions, which are ordinal partition networks, and applying them to data recorded from primates that have been anesthetized with either propofol and ketamine, and using these to show how we can tease apart information characteristic and unique to each one of these states of consciousness. Present some results, looking at basic network science measures, some information theoretic analysis, and then higher order structures. And then finally, we'll sort of bring it all home and talk about what this means going forwards. So most of us are, I'm sure, familiar with this image. It's been seen in many consciousness science presentations and papers. On the x-axis, you have the level of consciousness, which is essentially how awake or how sort of mobile and responsive to the environment you are. And on the y-axis, you have content of consciousness, which is sort of nebulously describes how rich or how interesting your phenomenological experience is. And while level of consciousness has been very well characterized in clinical settings, content of consciousness is still a little bit less well defined. And my hope is that some of the work that I'm going to show today will allow us to tease this idea of content of consciousness apart into somewhat more comprehensive and multidimensional ways of thinking about awareness. And so up until now, many or much of the work that's been done in sort of computational consciousness science is developing measures that assess the level or quantity of consciousness present in a patient, a person, or a system. And so a lot of these reduce just to scalar values, often of some measure of complexity. So you have the perturbational complexity index, Lempel-Ziff complexity. These have both been very well described. and are very applicable in clinical settings, as is the bispectral index, which was sort of the original one of these. And then you have more theoretical things like the integrated information phi value, which is claims to give a measure of how much consciousness is present in the system. And broadly speaking, all of these work very well for classifying, sort of different states of loss of consciousness. So you can discriminate very effectively between awake versus disorders of consciousness, sleep, NREM sleep, REM sleep, anesthesia, which is really great for clinical work where we're trying to determine, whether somebody is truly unconscious or if they're simply just locked in or something. However, when we're talking about sort of consciousness writ large, we sort of have to ask ourselves, do scalar values make sense? Consciousness feels much richer than just a dimmer switch on a light, right? Your conscious awareness can be rich, impoverished, fast, slow, captivating, euphoric, spiritual, painful. There are many different axes on which your phenomenological experience can change. And recently, Carhart, Harris, and Friston proposed that different states of consciousness can be modeled as movements through a state space, or what they call an energy landscape. And you can think about this as like plotting the trajectory of a dynamical system through its phase states. Here, instead of describing a single value on a one-dimensional axis, how complex is the brain activity, we're instead describing a landscape. And there we can start to look for a wider range of qualities. We can look for holes in the landscape where the system tends to get caught. Think of a ball rolling down a hill. We can see, how fast does your trajectory over the landscape move? How much area do you cover? Things like that, all of which can vary in different ways in different states. And so by looking at sort of this richer picture, we can hopefully start to tease out a little bit about how different states are different and why particular states feel the way they do, and then map that back onto measurable empirical brain dynamic data. Constructing these state transition landscapes is easier said than done. There's been a lot of work looking at neural manifolds, particularly in the multi-electrode array recording space. And manifolds are typically continuous and constructed by embedding lots of data using something like a principal component analysis, multidimensional scaling, or UMAP. And we can learn a lot from these manifolds, but in terms of sort of the state transition dynamics that we're interested in, continuous manifolds are hard to characterize because it's difficult to determine well what is a state, what is what is sort of the unit that we're looking at here. And so one possible alternative to a continuous manifold is to construct discrete network manifolds, which compresses the information down into a structure where every node is a state, and then weighted directed edges between nodes correspond to the transition probabilities from state A to state B. And this comes from a sort of emerging field of network analysis of time series, which has not yet been applied to neuroscience a tremendous amount, although I think there's a lot of promise here, and so I'm hoping to see it more in the future. The particular method of constructing a state transition network I'll be using is an ordinal partition network. And I won't sort of go into sort of the gory mathematical details because time limitations, but it builds on this idea of a permutation embedding that was first introduced by Bant and Pompey. And so what you do is you take a one-dimensional time series and perform just a classic time delay embedding using some suitable embedding dimension and lag. And then for each embedded vector, you construct the associated ordinal partition of that vector, right? So each element is replaced by its ordinal rank, essentially. So the smallest element of the vector gets a 0, the second smallest gets a 1, and etc. And so what this does is this takes a continuous time series and maps it down to a space of just d factorial possible states, right? Where d factorial is just the number of unique ordinal partitions you can make for an embedded vector with dimension d. And then each ordinal vector becomes the node, and then the directed edge is just the probability of transitioning to node J, conditioned that the system is currently sort of standing on node I or in state I. And a lot of this was introduced by McCulloch et al. In their 2015 paper in Chaos, which if this sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend you read. It's a great paper, and they go through some toy examples like a roster system to explain how these networks behave in much more detail than I can here. So here you can see just a visual intuition for doing the ordinal partition embeddings. You start with a slice of some continuous time series, and then for each point in the slice, you assign to it just its order. Here the order is how high up it is. So for the blue in the bottom right, the far right point is the lowest, so it gets a 0. The far left point is the next lowest, it gets a 1, and so on and so forth. So this is how you construct the ordinal partitions. And then once you've done that for the whole time series, you end up with something that looks like this network on the left, where you can see there are sort of these long loops of states that just deterministically feed into each other, and then some, denser states that, have a little bit more noise in them. You can see on the left, the associated transition probability matrix. And here I've colored the network nodes based on using an InfoMap community detection algorithm, and this will become relevant later. And you can see that sort of causally equivalent states are being grouped together, which is significant later on. The really nice thing about the ordinal partition network is that it encodes information about the system dynamics in its own static network topology. So for instance, the number of nodes gives you the size of the repertoire of states available to the system. The permutation entropy gives you a measure of sort of the flatness of the state space. 2 information theoretic analyses that I'm going to talk about: the determinism, which is just how predictable is the system, given that you are on state I, what is the entropy of the distribution of possible future states? Lower entropy means higher determinism, more predictable. Degeneracy is sort of the reverse. It's a measure of how irreversible are the dynamics due to information lost when past states flow into each other. And then modularity is how well is the system described by higher order dynamics, which gets at ideas of metastability that I'll talk about in just a moment. The data that I'm using is from the NeuroTycho database. And if you're interested in consciousness neuroscience and have never heard about this data set, hopefully this makes your day. It is a fully open source, freely available, invasive ECOG data set. It's from a group in Japan, and they have multiple monkeys. Here I'm using just 2, Chibi and George, and they implant 128 channel invasive ECOG arrays directly onto the cortex of these monkeys, and then record when the monkeys are awake, when they've been anesthetized with IV propofol, or anesthetized with intramuscular ketamine. And so I won't go into the sort of gory details of the pre-processing, but we made a number of non-overlapping 10-second slices of data, making sure these are areas with no artifacts. And then since the ordinal partition network is done on single channels, we constructed one network for every channel, for every one of the 12 non-overlapping slices, for each state, for each monkey. So it ends up being about 10,000 unique networks, which gives us a really rich picture and a high statistical power, even though we're sort of building it just on a small number of individual monkeys. So the first set of results is the number of nodes. And so here you can see the awake condition has the greatest number of nodes, saturating at around 120. And then propofol has the smallest number of nodes, which is almost half that of the awake condition. And then ketamine is somewhere in the middle, which is a pattern that we're going to see repeatedly, where it maintains some of the richness of the awake condition while also showing reductions, although not as severe as what we see in propofol anesthesia. On the right, you have the permutation entropy, which again is a measure of how flat is the state space. If every state was visited an equal number of times, you'd have a very high permutation entropy, which is what you see in the awake condition. If there are a subset of states that the system repeatedly returns to, you have a low permutation entropy, which is what you see in the propofol condition. And again, the ketamine condition is sort of in the middle, which is consistent with what we know about sort of the phenomenology of the ketamine experience. In some senses, it's like REM sleep, where the person or the monkey is unresponsive to external stimuli, but still having these sort of dream-like, sort of quasi-psychedelic experiences that suggest that consciousness is not completely annihilated, even at unresponsive doses of the drug. Determinism, again, so looking at the left, again, this is a measure of how predictable is the system dynamics and how resistant is it to perturbation. We can see that propofol here is actually the most deterministic, followed by ketamine, and then with the awake condition at the lowest. And this is very interesting when you consider sort of the differences between responsiveness, comparing propofol, ketamine, and the awake condition, where in the awake condition we would expect that an evolved system would have a high degree of flexibility. There are many states that it could respond to, or that it could transition into in response to changes in the environment. Whereas ketamine, people are almost completely unresponsive, and perturbations don't tremendously change sort of the overall structure of the state that much. Looking at degeneracy, here this is the first time that we see a break of the pattern of, awake ketamine propofol. Here, ketamine is the highest degeneracy, followed by propofol, and then the awake condition. And this is really interesting because recall that degeneracy is information that is lost when the system states sort of run into each other, which brings in a lot of ideas such as like the Landauer limit and things like that. And so here we can see that ketamine is in some way losing information about its own past faster than either propofol or the awake condition. And the awake condition has the lowest degeneracy in this context. And so, we're still trying to tease out sort of, the details of this, but we can see, that ketamine clearly on some axes has different dynamics and breaks the pattern that we've sort of gotten used to. It's not the case that ketamine is just propofol light, but actually, it is doing its own thing on things on certain axes. Finally, talk briefly about modularity and metastability. So metastability is this idea of winnerless competition between attracting macrostates, which has been hypothesized to be a core component of healthy brain dynamics and associated with all kinds of learning phenomena and things of that nature. In a state transition graph, there is a really natural mapping between metastable attractors and community detection measures. We would think that in a state transition graph where a walk on the graph corresponds to a possible trajectory the system could take, subsets of states or nodes where the walker tends to get transiently stuck correspond to sort of these attracting macrostates, which are areas where the system will be evolving through continuous space. It'll get stuck in an orbit or something and then escape. Here we're seeing the same thing on a network. And conveniently, there is a community detection algorithm that is sort of specifically designed to find communities based on their stickiness. It is the InfoMap community detection algorithm. And you can see a sort of a cartoon on the bottom right where you have an undifferentiated network. You run random walkers on it. You find the substates where the system tends to get stuck. And then you can renormalize this system into a macro scale network of attracting states, sort of attractor states. And this is what we've done in the here using InfoMap on the state transition networks. You can see on the top is the full microscale network with all of its states. And then, you run InfoMap on this network. You renormalize and collapse the communities down into macro states. And you can see that you end up with much fewer states and a much denser associated state transition matrix, which suggests that we are taking sort of degenerate information or redundant information present at the microscale and collapsing it down into macro scale. And we can measure how good is this mapping between micro and macro with the modularity, which is a sort of a goodness of fit measure of community detection in networks. And so here you can see that the propofol condition has the highest modularity, which means it's sort of most well described by these discrete sort of modules that the walker gets stuck in, and the awake condition has the lowest, with ketamine in the middle. And this is very interesting because you can think of modularity as being related to, but distinct from, the measure of permutation entropy I described earlier. Permutation entropy describes, does the system tend to return to microstates more than you would expect necessarily than by chance, whereas here, modularity is talking about sort of the macro state. We're looking at sets of states the system tends to get stuck in. And so here we're seeing sort of a similar dynamic playing out both at the micro scale and at the macro scale in the propofol and the awake conditions, which I think is interesting since multi-scale dynamics is a really key area in computational neuroscience going forward. And then finally, we can take all of these measures and use them to create an embedding, in this case using the UMAP algorithm. And so here, every point in the space is a single network. And then the distance between points corresponds to how similar they are. So now each network is plotted originally in a 5-dimensional space corresponding to the 5 measures that I've just gone through. And then we can use those, treat those as vectors in a space and use a dimensionality reduction algorithm to plot out sort of almost a meta manifold here. So instead of a discrete network manifold for every channel, instead now we have a meta manifold where the points are networks in the space as opposed to individual moments for a single channel. And so I really like this plot, partly because it looks like a watermelon Sour Patch Kid, but mostly because you can see that the awake, which is the pink condition, and the propofol condition are very separated from each other. Their distance in space gives you some intuition of sort of their dynamical differences. And then ketamine forms this sort of interesting boundary between them. But you can see that there are areas where the ketamine is sort of interpolated into the awake space, as well as areas where the ketamine is sort of interpolated into the propofol space, which is really getting at this idea that ketamine captures elements of both normal consciousness and anesthesia that are not necessarily present in either one considered individually. And so my hope is that this really drives home the idea that by moving beyond simple one-dimensional scalar values of consciousness, by looking at sort of these sort of dynamical morphospaces, we can start to get a much richer picture of how different states of consciousness relate to each other. And if we can start to tease out the significance of the individual measures that I've discussed before, we can make a much richer understanding of why does a particular state of consciousness feel the way it does, and how does that relate to the brain dynamics happening in the skull. And so finally, conclusions. Time-lagged ordinal partition networks capture multiple aspects of how brain dynamics change under conditions, and they're sensitive enough to discriminate between different states of propofol and ketamine, which externally appear very similar but are characterized internally by very different phenomenological aspects. The propofol condition is associated with stronger metastable basins of attraction and lower entropy microscale dynamics, where while the awake condition had the flattest state space. And ketamine sort of, depending on what measure you were looking at, can appear in some ways to be more like propofol or more like the awake condition. And then when you cluster all of these measures together, you can really start to see how these different states relate to each other. So thanks to my collaborators, Dr. Alice Petania at the Indiana University Network Sciences Institute, who is absolutely, none of this could have happened without her. My mentor, Dr. Olaf Sporns, network science guru, trying to turn him on to this consciousness stuff. Miss Vanessa Denny, who's a research assistant in our lab, she helped out with some of this. And then the entire Sporns lab for friendship and support. I'm supported by the National Science Foundation Research Traineeship in Complex Networks and Systems, and Alice is supported by the Indiana University Network Sciences Institute. Finally, shameless plug, if you have consciousness-related data that you are looking to share or are looking for a collaborator or just want to talk about what I've discussed here, please email me. I'm always looking to meet new people in the consciousness neuroscience space and form some new connections and make new friends. So don't hesitate to email me at all. Thank you.
Hi, this is Scott Shannon. I want to welcome you to this segment, which is going to talk about ketamine gamma synchrony and the shaping of consciousness. And really what we're going to be exploring today is what interface does ketamine, gamma synchrony, and consciousness have that can help us to better understand what's going on with human consciousness, how we can explore it better, and its potential and capacity to heal. And I'll give you just a little bit about my background. I'm an integrative psychiatrist, and I work in Fort Collins, Colorado at a multidisciplinary clinic called Wholeness Center. And we've spun off a nonprofit called the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute. We do work with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and severe PTSD, part of the phase 3 MAP study, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We do a lot of work with ketamine, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we've done a fair amount of work with cannabidiol and published 4 papers on that as well. And really what draws me to this is that I've been a student of consciousness for 4 decades or more, going back to my undergraduate thesis at the University of Arizona in the early 1970s, which was guided and mentored by Dr. Andrew Weil. And over that time, I've had the opportunity to look at many different paths and tools that help and shape consciousness and really help give us opportunities for healing. So today it's an exploration, and I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned and raise some questions. So the talk is really sort of examining what is gamma synchrony, what does ketamine do, and how do these things interface to give us a better understanding of what's going on with human consciousness. So in terms of disclosures, I've published 4 books, and I'm a PI researcher for the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and in terms of our research with MDMA. So in the agenda, what we're going to be talking about is gamma synchrony, Stuart Hameroff's theory on conscious pilot, explore what is gamma power, what does that mean, and what does this begin to tell us about consciousness and sort of the neurological foundations. We'll explore how ketamine interfaces here, and then talk about why this is important and what effect it has for healing. So if we look at neural synchrony, and neural synchrony is really the source of much of our EEG, and it's these self-perpetuating waves that move through the brain, and it's really a self-organizing system. There is no center which triggers this, directs this. It's something we really don't understand very well. But it creates these coherent states of neural activity that are phase locked in the same way that a laser is phase lock light activity. And as I mentioned, there's really no superordinate coordinating center. There's no neural synchrony center. There's no pacemaker, if you will, in the brain that does this. And it occurs between widely separated systems in the brain, these network and hubs, and there's really no clear pathway to help us understand what this is, what it does, what's the reason for this. We have some ideas now. And there is short distance neural synchrony and long distance neural synchrony. And in terms of the neural correlate of consciousness, it appears to be more like long distance neural synchrony. And this can range anywhere from high beta in the upper 20s into the gamma range up to 60 or more cycles per second. And what it seems clear is that from what we've done with studies, QEEG studies, quantitative electroencephalogram studies, that neural synchrony seems to be really dependent on highly focused activities where we're trying to integrate sensory activity from our eyes, from our legs, from our ears. We're trying to understand how things group together. We're trying to pull in memories that are distant and connected, or really trying to keep something in mind in short-term working memory, like a phone number that we want to remember so we can dial it back out after listening to it. Now, what's interesting is that we get into these patterns that are sort of long-lasting and stable, like with sleep and drowsiness, and they can be fast and reactive, such as when things are coming at us and we have to process and react. So it's really a range of things. Now, the other thing that's interesting about neural synchrony is when it is disturbed, we have alterations in consciousness. And if we can look at the data with schizophrenia, with autism, with Alzheimer's, with epilepsy, but what connects all of these is that they're aberrations in our primary degree of consciousness, our sense of self. And this is one of the things that makes autism and schizophrenia such challenging things to work with in the mental health arena, that we really don't understand them at all. They're some of the most profound alterations of neuroanatomy and neurochemistry that we've seen, and people's sense of self is markedly different. And consciousness, as we understand it, appears to be different. The same thing is true with Alzheimer's and epilepsy, is that at least certainly while epileptic activity is going on, consciousness is very altered and very different. So we begin to understand that neural synchrony seems to have some tie into consciousness, some tie into abnormal mental states. What else can we figure out? Now, what's interesting is that this is from Stuart Hameroff's work. Subsequent studies have shown that gamma synchrony in various brain locations correlating with conscious perception, motor control, language, working memory, face and word recognition, sleep, wake, and dream cycles, and binding. The issue of how neural computation representations that occur in very different brain regions and at slightly different moments are bound together in consciousness, connected in our awareness and consciousness. What is the link that ties this together? So Stuart Hameroff's work is really trying to understand that consciousness may be a mobile, gamma-synchronized dendritic web that really moves throughout the brain and the nervous system and can focus on areas like movement or auditory perception or taste, depending on where we're pulled. Now, one of the other things that's interesting is this has been dismissed by some people because the conscious pilot does not depend on axonal firing. That is really neural computation, or more the processing part of the central nervous system. And the other thing that's very interesting about this dendritic web, this gamma synchrony, is it's really dependent on gap junction firing, which is our closest connection to actual electrical firing. It's the fastest and most responsive way to get cells linked and connected and synchronous. So we begin to see that this conscious web is driven by this neural synchrony that is mobile, that has awareness as a driver, but that we can also have moments where we go on autopilot, in which the brain is just doing its processing thing, somewhat out of our immediate awareness. It's like driving a car and getting to your destination and realizing that you don't really even remember doing the driving. You were just on autopilot and just somewhere else in your awareness. So if we think gamma is this higher range of frequency within the brain, and now with the electrical measurements such as the quantitative EEG, we can really get a sense of frequency, amplitude, and really power. And power is the amount of power generated by these different frequencies that can really be calculated based on the amplitude of the waves. So we know that clearly there are a few things that enhance gamma power. One is ketamine, one is meditation, one is nitrous oxide, and one is neurofeedback. There may be some others, but these are prominent ones that have been replicated and well proven. Now, the interesting thing about meditation, this goes to Richie Davidson's work in the just after 2000, in which he found that, let's see, I think I'm going to skip ahead, yeah. He found that he took Tibetan monks who had been meditating for at least 10,000 hours, some of them 30 to 40,000 hours, and began to measure their EEG. And what he found is when they dropped into these deep meditative states, their gamma power went off the charts. It was the highest gamma power and gamma synchrony readings ever found. And if we think that this can be somehow correlated with consciousness, these people may be the most profoundly conscious people that we've encountered. And it's a skill that can be trained. It's something that you can learn. And there's really a dose curve that the more people had been meditating, the more that they had gamma synchrony and gamma power. So the other thing with neurofeedback, this is real-time brainwave biofeedback, where you can use a video interface such as Shrek here, and this young girl, once she increases her amplitude or decreases amplitude, depending on what they're trying to do, the movie will play. And if she's failing in her biofeedback, the movie will stop. So it's only when she goes above certain set thresholds. And you can do this in a training model where you can make the thresholds fairly easy to accomplish. But neurofeedback has been shown to be able to enhance gamma power, alpha power, beta power, really any of the targets that we can measure and feedback, we can change. So let's look at ketamine. Ketamine's been around for a while in very wide use since 1970. It's preferred battlefield anesthetic. But what's interesting about it is it's not an anesthetic like other ones, that it doesn't put you asleep, make you unconscious. It's a dissociative where you become disconnected from the room, your body, your brain, really, and but are still acutely aware. And it's widely used around the world. We have a number of studies that show that ketamine enhances gamma power. And so if you look at the right-hand side of this screen, you'll see basically the way this is set up is that these are set up with z-scores and these are set up to show what is happening with gamma power. So the brighter reds are increased power and activity, and this is compared to norms. So what you can see is that compared to the placebo on the top line, gamma power is much enhanced on the second line, far to the right. You can see that ketamine also does some other things, such as with delta and theta. But the most prominent effect, the most pronounced effect, is to increase gamma power. We have other studies, once again, that confirm this. So look at the top line, low gamma, high gamma, much increased, much red activity. So this shows enhanced activity significantly compared to placebo. And that's the bottom line, is the comparison between the two. So we also know that ketamine can be helpful in major depression. And so if they give healthy adults and unmedicated adults with major depressive disorder a ketamine IV, they see robust increases in gamma power and gamma amplitude. And interestingly enough, the change from baseline to post-ketamine predicts the response in major depressive disorder. So what does ketamine actually do to the brain? We know that it's an NMDA receptor antagonist, but it really does more. What it does most profoundly is interrupt the circuits between the cortex of the brain and the thalamus. And so what that does is it begins to disconnect our frontal lobes, our parietal lobes, our occipital lobes. It disconnects us from our sense of self. It disconnects us from the room, our personal narrative. And in some ways, you could sum this up by saying our ego. That may not be an exact correlate, but it's pretty close. When you're fully dissociated on ketamine, there's very little cortical activity going on other than the gamma power and gamma synchrony. And how are these two things interrelated? We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the default mode network. That is this network of interactive hubs and networks in the brain that gives us a sense of our personal narrative and who we are. This is our most profound sense of self. And this is dramatically altered and knocked down by ketamine, as it is with the classic psychedelics, but in a different way. So what does ketamine do to consciousness? If you talk to people that are just been through a ketamine experience, people relate a heightened sense of awareness. They're not sedated, drowsy, but acutely aware and alert. At full dissociation, there's no sense of self. There's no I, me, Scott. There's no body. There's no worries. There's no sadness. We're not worried about what we need to pick up at the store or what the woman said to us over the fence in the backyard, etc. There's this deeper sense of connection to self, others, the universe. There's an almost immediate loss of suicidal ideation. We see a strong boost to both mood and energy following these treatments. And most everybody sees their personal struggle in a different light. So what links all these things together? Interestingly, as you go higher in ketamine dose from these, what we call sub-anesthetic doses that we use in psychiatry and with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, gamma power begins to fade and changes to gamma bursts that are periodic and not sustained. At the same time, and this is really simultaneous, conscious awareness and effective recall deteriorates. So once you get people up to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram or even 2.0, they're no longer hyper-aware. They may have some isolated memory, and it's much less helpful for therapy, and it seems much less helpful for the mood benefit. So how are these things all tied together? One of the ways we can think about this is that what we're doing in this situation by knocking out all the cortical pathways that are often maladaptive, we're creating a different energetic pattern within the brain. And we can think about this in chaos theory, that on the left side, people's depression, their anxiety, their trauma, they're stuck in a pathological energetic state where the red ball is and not able to get back to the attractor that's our healthy, normal state. But if you look at the right side, some massive intervention like ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, treatment with psychedelics such as psilocybin, even our MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, you see a dramatic change in the ecology of the brain. We're shifting into gamma power, which is this heightened sense of awareness and consciousness. And at the same time, we're turning off all these maladaptive programs that are running typically in our frontal lobes, that default mode network that's overactive in the depressed patient. And because of this dramatic ecological shift, shaking the snow globe dramatically, we're able to move into the healthier state, an attractor state that's more profound, more connected, more like our initial inborn operating system, our path to health and wholeness. So really what we see in all this is that we're using ketamine to enhance awareness, to enhance cognitive depth, which helps us with memory, recall, activation, insight, and awareness around the healing that's going on. And at the same time, we're turning off these maladaptive states. And as we turn off the maladaptive states that are using so much energy and drain, this can be as much as 70 to 90% of the power in the brain at any given time is going to the default mode network and activities. One interesting aside is that if you give someone an algebra problem, the power demand, the power utilization of the brain goes down significantly because we turn off the default mode network. We turn off all this self-rumination about who we are and what's going on in our lives. And we focus on a simple task. The brain does that much better and with much less energy demand. The only thing that significantly decreases energy demand like this is meditation. So that's a sort of a bit of a summary, an overview of what we're looking at with gamma power, gamma synchrony, this ability to turn off the frontal lobes of the brain, decrease energy demand, and that energy then go into a robust enhancement of gamma power and gamma synchrony, which in itself may be healing, but it also enhances awareness, changes our stuck state, and allows us to move on and use the power of consciousness for healing. So it's with that, I'd like to wrap up and say I really appreciate attention to this. I think this is very provocative. And I think this is really the path that psychiatry needs to go, is the combination of looking and mapping at the brain with alterations in consciousness and awareness that allow us to get to states of healing and get out of our stuck place. All right. Appreciate it. You all take care. Thanks. Bye.
Hello, I'm Dr. Raquel Bennett from KRIA Institute, and I'm giving a talk today for the Science of Consciousness Conference housed at the University of Arizona in September 2020. The topic of my talk today will be the paradigms of ketamine treatment. In other words, different approaches to working with ketamine for a psychiatric indication in a clinical practice. Before I get started, I want to express some gratitude for the organizers of this conference, Dr. Hammeroff, who is the conference chair, and the other members of the conference committee, and especially for Abby, the conference manager. I know she's been working hard to put this all together, and I think we're all really grateful for her efforts. Thank you. Anyway, a little bit about me. I'm a psychologist and ketamine specialist located in Berkeley, California. I specialize in the diagnosis and treatment of people who are living with severe depression or bipolar disorder, or who are living with active suicidal ideation. I first encountered ketamine in 2002 and thought that it had some pretty prominent antidepressant effects, which weren't known or appreciated at that time. And I've actually been studying this for the last 18 years. In particular, the relationship between mood modulation and psychedelic experience. Let's see, I work in a clinical practice in collaboration with medical professionals to provide excellent psychological and clinical care, and also to provide ketamine treatments, and also to provide consultation to other clinicians. I am the proud founder of KRIA Institute and also KRIA Conference. Both of them are devoted to the use of ketamine in psychiatry and psychotherapy. And I have no disclosures of any kind, nor any financial conflicts of interest to report. Anyway, so let's get into it. Let's talk about ketamine. The thing is that there's a lot of disagreement in the field about how to use this tool, which is really quite interesting. I think there's validity to all the different approaches. So as we start talking about that, the first thing to know is that there's a couple of different variables in ketamine treatment. In other words, there's a couple of things, a couple of choice points for clinicians. So let me first outline what those variables are. First is the route of administration. There's a lot of different ways to get ketamine into a patient's body, and each route has different bioavailability. There's different dosing strategies. The question is how much ketamine to put into the patient's body in a single session or at any given time. There's quite a bit of disagreement about this. There's the frequency of the sessions. In other words, how often should we be doing this, or what's going to be beneficial for the patient? Different ideas about that. There's different ideas about the setting. It turns out that setting is a critical variable, I think, in the use of various visionary and sacred medicines, one that's often underappreciated, but I do think that optimal setting is important for optimal outcomes. And finally, there's a lot of different ideas in the field about clinical presence. In other words, the ketamine provider, what their idea is about what they're supposed to be doing during the ketamine administration itself. In other words, the clinician, what they think their role is or where their attention should be. So let me just elaborate on that for a quick second. Some providers really prioritize focusing on the physical or medical safety of the patient. And they're not paying a lot of attention to the patient's psychological experience. Other folks are psychotherapists, and they are heavily emphasizing engaging in a psychotherapeutic dialogue with the patient. In other words, they're trying to provide psychotherapy concurrent with the ketamine administration. And yet other providers think of themselves as psychedelic guides. They are trying to hold the space in a loving and unintrusive way, quietly, etc. So as you can see, people have some different ideas about how to be present as a clinician in ketamine treatment. And again, all of them have merit. We'll come to that a little later. Anyway, okay, now that we've outlined the variables in ketamine treatment, the things that you can control, what I'd like to do next is describe the three dominant paradigms, the three different ideas about how to use ketamine in a clinical practice. So the first of the three ideas is often referred to as the NIMH protocol. Sometimes it's just called the research protocol. This was utilized by researchers at NIMH, etc. So in this protocol, they borrowed it actually from their colleagues in anesthesia. In this protocol, what typically happens is that the patient who has been first selected for ketamine treatment, typically because they have depression or one of the other clinical indications for this. The patient has been selected and then come for their ketamine administration. They're receiving 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of ketamine in the form of an infusion, typically dripped over 40 minutes. More in the last year also, now it's possible to do this with nasal spray. We'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, the magic number here is 0.5 mg/kg. And the reality is that this often isn't powerful enough to induce a robust antidepressant effect in most patients. So the way that they get around that is they use the Diamond and McShane protocol from 2014, in which the patient is administered 6 sessions, 6 administrations of ketamine infusion in a 2 or sometimes a 3-week period. So the patient is coming in 3 times or sometimes 2 times a week. So the idea here is to make the treatment cumulative. In other words, to get enough ketamine into the patient's body to do the magic antidepressant thing that ketamine does. However, in this form of treatment, the psychedelic properties of ketamine are considered a nuisance or an annoying and problematic side effect to be avoided or to be medicated or treated in some way. So the premise of this treatment is to somehow get enough ketamine into the patient's body, but without, specifically, explicitly, without inducing psychedelic experience in any individual treatment session. That's the premise of this treatment. And it takes about, the patient is on a 40-minute drip, but in reality it takes 2.5 hours to actually complete the whole session, including the check-in and the check-out. Patients describe this, patients have a great variety of experience actually, but it's not uncommon for patients to describe this as psychoactive, but clearly not fully dissociative and minimally psychedelic. Sometimes patients describe this as drinking 2 glasses of wine on an empty stomach. They feel a little bit sleepy and a little disinhibited and maybe a little nauseous. But all in all, they're able to continue to talk to you. They know who they are, and they know where they are at all times during the treatment. As I said, this is dosed in the sub-psychedelic range on purpose because the psychedelic properties of ketamine are considered problematic in this way of thinking about ketamine. Often, providers who work in this way put a lot of emphasis on medical monitoring and physical safety of the patient, which is very important, and tend to undervalue or underappreciate the psychological or visionary or psychospiritual components of ketamine. And, this is fundamentally a medical or a surgical model. If you ask providers who work in this paradigm why the ketamine worked or why the patient is getting better, those providers will typically give you an explanation that focuses on biology and physiology. They'll talk about what the ketamine is doing at the cellular level, or more specifically at the level of the receptors or the neurons. They may even talk about brain regions, but it's definitely a paradigm that emphasizes the biology, chemistry, and physiology of the patient. In this model, typically there's no concurrent psychotherapy. That's considered not needed. And as I said, the psychedelic properties of ketamine is a very psychedelic and visionary, or sometimes it's referred to as a hallucinogenic or dissociative medicine. But all these things are considered undesirable. In fact, in the literature, researchers have often referred to ketamine as psychotomimetic, meaning that the ketamine experience mimics or induces psychosis. This, of course, is completely not the case. If you have ever been with a patient who was receiving ketamine and compared them to a patient who has something like schizophrenia, you can clearly see how different qualitatively these experiences are. So I think that psychotomimetic is a pejorative way of expressing disdain for the psychedelic properties of ketamine. But anyway, here's the thing. The thing is that there's no doubt that ketamine does something on a biological level that improves some kinds of depression and also improves some kinds of ruminative or obsessional suicidal ideation. There's no doubt that ketamine, in fact, does that for some folks. But here's the problem. There's two problems. In this model, one problem is that the patient is forced into a passive position. All the magic or all the healing is attributed to the medication, and the patient isn't called upon to participate in their session in any way except to somehow show up for the session. But beyond that, they don't have to do anything. They are the passive recipient of this powerful medication. And while that's a great model for lots of procedures and treatments in medicine, I'm not sure that that's the best way to help someone who's having a chronic mental health problem. I want the patient to be empowered to work on their own behalf as much as possible. So I think that's a limitation of this model. The other problem is that in this model, it's very medication focused, and because there's no psychotherapy in this approach, the patients are not necessarily learning any new skills. And so, this medication is somewhat short-lasting. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so when the effect of the ketamine wears off, the patient then has to return for more ketamine treatment unless there's other interventions utilized. And so in that way, you're essentially making the patient dependent on ketamine treatment. And I have a question about whether that's a good idea. I wonder if there's another way to do this. What we don't want to do is to create people having dependency on medications or chemicals, or even worse, an army of addicts. And so I actually think there's a better way to do this. So before I go to the next paradigm, I also want to make a note about S-ketamine. So S-ketamine is one of the enantiomers or isomers of racemic ketamine. I don't have time to explain that right this second. But anyway, S-ketamine is a product that got FDA approval. It's made by Johnson & Johnson. It's insanely expensive. It has been shown to be clinically non-inferior to racemic or cheap or generic ketamine. I'm not sure exactly what non-inferior means, but anyway, there's no evidence that S-ketamine is clinically superior in any way to racemic ketamine, and so from my perspective, it's hard to justify the added cost. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up now is because the Ketamine Protocol, the nasal spray, it's also called Spravato. This protocol is essentially based on the research protocol I just described, the infusion protocol. The dosing is subpsychedelic. The patient comes in for an induction series a couple of times clustered together, and then may go on for maintenance treatment. The psychedelic properties are considered an annoying and problematic side effect, not valued, and there's no psychotherapy that is required in that treatment model. So in that sense, the low-dose ketamine infusion and the S-ketamine nasal spray are in the same paradigm. So you can chew on that. But in any case, now I want to talk about a different approach to working with ketamine. It's the same medicine, it's just a different philosophy with different values. So the next approach to ketamine treatment that I want to talk about is ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy. So this is profoundly different from the previous research protocol, because here the emphasis is on the psychotherapy dialogue, and in fact requires a experienced psychotherapist, a skillful psychotherapist, to be participating. So in this way of working, it's still mostly sub-psychedelic, actually. You don't want the patient too far out, because then they don't want to talk to you, or they may not remember that they have a mouth. So that would be a problem. But I'm kidding. But in any case, you would work with a low to moderate dose of ketamine, typically given by injection or in a transbuccal lozenge. But anyway, the purpose of this treatment is to help the patient, to use the medicine, to use the ketamine as a catalyst for the psychotherapy process. And the emphasis here is really on the psychotherapy dialogue. And the idea here is to help the patient to talk about material that is too painful or too shameful to get to otherwise. And so in that sense, this approach to working with ketamine is very similar to what's being studied now by MAPS, the MDMA protocol for treating PTSD, where the medicine is seen as a catalyst in the psychotherapy process. This is the same fundamental idea. So you can usually fit this into a double session if you do it correctly. And patients, the patient's experience, here's what they typically say. They usually say that they find the ketamine treatment to be relaxing and pleasant and slightly disinhibiting. Sometimes patients experience a slight change in perspective that can be leveraged to help them see material in a different way. But I'll tell you the truth, what I see the most in providing this treatment is something that I call the consolidation of psychological insight. And it's really hard to describe, but what I mean is that typically we are revisiting material that we've already talked about in psychotherapy, in regular psychotherapy. I'm not going searching, spelunking, digging up new material. I'm not doing that. I think that would be problematic. But rather, patients, what you see is the most amazing thing. Their understanding of a problem or situation in their life appears to drop from being intellectualized, like located in their skull, to being somatic, being like located in their body. And they like finally get it, and the insight consolidates. And then sometimes that leads to a lasting gain. I have so much more to say about this, but in the interest of time, I'll save that for another time. But anyway, it's really a fascinating phenomenon. Anyway, the clinicians who practice in this way, they're practicing in fundamentally psychological and relational paradigm. In other words, both the patient and the therapist are both working pretty darn hard on the patient's behalf. Each of us is exerting 50% of the effort towards the patient's wellness. Again, there's psychotherapy in this model, and the psychotherapy is valued. More than that, the psychotherapy is essential and central to this process. Again, as I said, the dose is typically sub-psychedelic or not fully dissociative when you're trying to do this kind of work. But this approach has a significant limitation, and here's what it is. The challenge is that psychotherapy is time-consuming, it can be very slow, and it can be very expensive. And so until we figure out a better way to make this treatment more accessible, that is definitely a limitation of this approach to the work. Do I have anything else I want to say about this? Yeah, I do. It would appear that the presence of ketamine or ketamine administration, that it opens up a neuroplastic window, which probably has physiological correlates underlying it. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'll leave this to the neuroscientists to explain it. But here's what I do know. It would appear that the presence of ketamine touches off a chemical cascade that leads ultimately, at least to protein synthesis that leads to dendritic sprouting and the formation of new neural connections. In other words, a synaptogenesis. And we don't know exactly how long this process takes in humans, but it probably takes a couple of days. It looks like it takes 2.5 days in rodent models. So probably somewhere in that ballpark for people. But anyway, why is this important? Why am I bringing this up now? It's important because what we've observed is that learning is particularly potent during this neuroplastic window, while these new neural connections are being created and essentially hardwired in. And so psychotherapy in this period is particularly potent. It appears that it starts right when the ketamine is administered, and then there's a little window there that lasts a day or two. And so this is really important. This is a time to optimize psychotherapy and its impactfulness. Again, from my perspective, the ultimate goal of treatment is to help the patient have insight and learn new coping skills, such that ideally they're not dependent on medication forever. I want my patients to get well. I want them to stay well as much as possible. So there's no doubt in my mind that for most patients, ketamine treatment, you get the most benefit from it when you combine it with concurrent psychotherapy. So I think that's really interesting. I also just wanted to make a side note here that I think it's important to parse out two different kinds of approaches to ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy. I think the optimal way to use ketamine is to embed ketamine sessions occasionally in the course of an ongoing, depth-oriented psychotherapy treatment or relationship. So one where the patient and the clinician know each other quite well, and where there's a strong therapeutic alliance and, frankly, a lot of love and trust that has built up over time. So I think that's the optimal way to use this tool. But, you know, and that isn't possible for everyone. So something else that folks are doing is doing a little short course of psychotherapy where a new patient is coming in to see a provider that they don't know, and they're doing a little bit of psychotherapy with ketamine. So I think we need to really ask the question, is that as effective as putting ketamine into a depth therapy? And the answer is I don't know. The data will ultimately have to show us. Anyway, let me continue on here. I said that there were 3 different approaches to ketamine treatment. And so let's talk now about the third paradigm. So the third way to use this tool is to use it to provide psychedelic ketamine journeys. In other words, to invite or induce psychedelic or dissociative or mystical experience on purpose. Because as a provider, you have 2 ideas. Number 1, you believe that the visions might be beneficial or useful to the patient. And also as a provider, that you have carefully selected the patient to ensure that this would be psychologically safe and appropriate for that patient. So this is a caveat that not all patients are a good candidate for psychedelic dosing of ketamine. And if you want to learn more about that, I'd like to recommend that you take a clinical training, and I'll talk more about that at the end. But anyway, back to this. In working with psychedelic ketamine journeys, typically what happens is that the patient is administered at least 1.0 up to 1.5, maybe in some cases up to 2.0 milligrams per kilogram of bioavailable ketamine as per their body weight. This is usually done by injection. I happen to think that the sweet spot for most people is around 1.25 milligrams per kilogram of injectable ketamine, with a little bit of variation here and there. Let's see here. What does this actually look like? Well, again, the patient has to go through a very careful selection process and special psychological preparation for this to be safe and appropriate. And then you would do a ketamine administration, or probably several, and that would be followed by integration or follow-up psychological care. During the ketamine session per se, the ketamine session itself, typically what happens is that the physician gives the patient a shot of ketamine, and then the patient is in the space of active medicine in partial or full dissociation. In other words, also accompanied by partial paralysis. They're basically in pre-anesthesia, and they are minimally responsive to external stimuli for a good hour plus, hour and a half. And typically when we schedule these, we schedule at least 4 hours and sometimes 6. So it might, take half a day or even the whole day to do this, so that people have enough time to get into the space and then recover. I forgot to say that after the active medicine, that patients need an hour or two of sedated recovery. They're still medicated. And then after that, we eat. We have the patients bring their sack lunch, and we eat with them and talk with them. Anyway, the active medicine phase of this, as I said, it lasts a little over an hour. In the active medicine phase, patients are experiencing dissociation, in other words, a loss of awareness or loss of contact with their body or their sensory input organs. They're largely immobilized, and they are having colorful, dream-like visions. The role of the follow-up psychotherapy is to help the patient extract or construct meaning out of those visions, to see if they can understand, or if there's a sense of a message in the medicine. I happen to think that there always is a message in the medicine. You're not really doing psychotherapy exactly while the patient is in active medicine. That wouldn't be possible. But you would do psychotherapy later on the same day, or potentially the next day or the following day, to help the patient make sense of their experience. Anyway, this is fundamentally a psychedelic or shamanic approach to working with ketamine, and for a couple of reasons. One of them is because the visions are valued. The visionary experience is considered essential and meaningful. It's not a problematic side effect. We're not trying to avoid it, but rather we're inviting it in. There's so much I could say about this. Let me just hold that thought. Anyway, do I have anything else I want to say about this? Yeah, the key limitation about this approach, the key limitation here is that this approach would not be safe or appropriate for lots of clients. So I think it's a clinical mistake to do this indiscriminately. I think that patients have to be carefully and judiciously selected. What else do I want to say about this? A couple of other notes. What I've noticed, having done this now for almost 2 decades, is that patients, in order for patients to have beautiful, expansive experience, it's highly dependent on the patient feeling safe, physically safe and psychologically safe. So in other words, the setting has to be safe from a medical perspective, and the relational context, the relationship between the provider and the patient, has to feel emotionally safe. I can't stress enough how important both of these factors are in effective psychedelic ketamine treatment. I thought it would be interesting to note that there's a couple of themes, there's some thematic content that comes up really frequently in patients' psychedelic ketamine journeys. So I thought I would talk about that for a moment. It's remarkable how often patients talk about something along the lines of some iteration of being in the presence of God during their dissociative ketamine experience. Some of the other words that they might use, they talk a lot about having a sense of profound divinity or experiencing themselves as sacred and divine. Other people talk about this in a similar way. They talk about experiencing supreme love or divine love or total acceptance in their ketamine journey. This happens so much. It's a fascinating phenomenon. It happens to people all over the country and all over the world. I don't know how ketamine is doing this, but this seems to be one of the prominent properties of ketamine. Again, highly dependent on the setting also. Another theme that comes up a lot in psychedelic exploration is that people realize the oneness of everything. They have a profound sense that people and life, or people and the planet, are connected, and that this often seems like a satisfying realization. I could say a lot more about this, but I'm going to save that thought. And then I just wanted to make a note that one thing that's kind of amusing is that patients in psychedelic ketamine journeys seem to experience a lot of space travel, a lot of interplanetary stuff, stars and planets and cosmos and all that. I don't know why that is, but certainly it comes up pretty frequently. Anyway, let me just recap what I just said. So basically what I've done here is I've outlined for you 3 different approaches to clinical ketamine treatment. So just to go back to recap, the first paradigm that I described, the research protocol, or working with S-ketamine nasal spray, in that case, the emphasis is on ketamine as a pharmaceutical intervention. In other words, the emphasis is on the chemical properties of ketamine. And then I went on to describe a different approach. I talked a little bit about ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy, where the emphasis is really on the psychotherapy process, the psychotherapy dialogue. And then I finally went on to describe a third approach to ketamine treatment, psychedelic ketamine journeys, where the emphasis of the treatment, or the emphasis, is really on inviting psychedelic experience. So these are 3 different ways of thinking about ketamine treatment, and frankly, this way of conceptualizing actually applies to all the different visionary medicines, not just ketamine, but I'm a ketamine specialist, so I'll stick with that. Anyway, as you can imagine, one of the questions that I get asked the most frequently is which of these paradigms, which of these approaches is the most effective? As a provider, which one should I provide? As a patient, which of these services should I buy? Which one is right for me? And I'll tell you the answer. The answer is that different things work well for different people. And so all of these approaches are valuable. Some patients, particularly medically complicated patients, really are a good candidate for the low-dose ketamine infusion approach. And other folks are tied up in psychological knots on the inside, and they really are a good candidate for ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy. And a really small percentage of folks really are a good candidate for psychedelic exploration. Anyway, here's what I want to say. I want to say that the ethical and competent ketamine clinician really appreciates the spectrum of ketamine services and understands different routes of administration and different dosing strategies, and is flexible in what they do. The ethical ketamine provider matches the treatment to the patient and isn't hung up on one right way, but rather understands that this is a flexible tool and that there are different ways of using it. I also want to say that in reality, lots of providers work fluidly with in these different paradigms, but we also combine them together sometimes. I teach them as separate paradigms for learning purposes, but actually the truth is that if we're going to do a psychedelic treatment with someone, the medicine is still doing something on a chemical level. And we're attentive to all of the frame and boundary issues and all of the dialogue and all of the psychological material that happens in a treatment. And the patient may be having visions during part of their treatment. And so all of it is actually working synergistically together. it's not one or the other. It's actually a combination of these approaches that I think is helping the patient. Anyway, before I wrap up, I just have a couple of other notes. Let me just quickly check the time here. Okay, a couple of other things thoughts I want to leave you with tonight. So one thing that's important to remember is that ketamine really is intended to be an adjunctive treatment for depression or for other psychiatric disorders. It doesn't work well as a standalone. And I think I have to question the ethics of physicians who advertise ketamine infusion as a standalone treatment and neglect to mention all the other important aspects of integrative clinical care. So, in other words, ketamine should never be the entire treatment plan for a psychiatric or psychological issue, in my opinion. And in my experience, the patients who get well and who stay well over time are patients who have multiple components in their treatment plan. So just as a quick example, here are some things that might be in somebody's treatment plan: exercise, nutrition, sleep schedule, learning mindfulness, psychotherapy or a support group. We may also need to use conventional oral medication. Patients, some of them really need help in having some recreational activities or some social activities. Patients, many of them benefit from cultivating a spiritual practice. People also benefit from sunshine and time out in nature. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of these things are free. And so, we want to help patients to use as many free resources as possible. And so again, I would say that the ethical ketamine provider takes the time to explain the importance of integrative care to each and every patient. Let's see, do I have anything else I want to say tonight? Yeah, I want to touch on a couple of other quick things. People often ask about the duration of the effect of ketamine treatment. So let's just talk about that for a quick moment. The reality is that the chemical effect, the effect on a chemical level, if that's all we're looking at, that effect is temporary, probably 2 weeks at the most from a single ketamine administration. You can get it to be a little bit longer, probably a couple months, if you do a clustered series of ketamine administrations. But all in all, the effect wears off. It sort of has a prominent effect for about a week, and then kind of like a more subtle tail that lasts another week. So like, as I said, about 14 days altogether when it's dosed correctly. But I don't think that's the whole story. And here's why. Because if you combine ketamine with psychotherapy and you do psychological work alongside the ketamine treatment, sometimes that work is beneficial, and it's beneficial over time, and it can be enduring. People untie knots or have insights or realizations or unburden themselves in a way that lasts honestly for years sometimes. And similarly, people sometimes, if you work in the psychedelic range, people sometimes have visions that are meaningful, that they're literally chewing on it or still referring back to it years later. So one of the challenges here is that in conventional psychotherapy and psychiatry, we don't do a good job of doing longitudinal studies on the impact of these visionary experiences or these psychological experiences on patients over time. So the fact that patients sometimes report that this is one of the most educational and most meaningful experiences of their entire lives, that fact is often missed. And so the question is, how do you quantify the duration of effect for experiences that have the potential to be so profound? And the answer is, I don't know, but I think that we need to start looking at that in the qualitative research. So the chemical effect is temporary, but the psychospiritual effect could be long-lasting. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. Let's see, what else did I want to say tonight? One of the big drawbacks of ketamine treatment is that it's currently expensive. I think we all need to be thinking together about how to increase accessibility to this treatment and to, as I said, to the spectrum of ketamine services. And so here's how I think we could do that. We need to be using generic racemic ketamine as much as possible. It's dirt cheap. It's broadly available as a medical supply. So we shouldn't be afraid to use it. There's a substantial body of academic literature that supports the use of ketamine for 5 major indications, including depression, bipolar depression, pain with depression, ruminative suicidal ideation, and OCD. Those are the big 5. Anyway, we should be using racemic ketamine. We should be using injectable ketamine. It's easy to do. The IV setup isn't really necessary. It's cheap. It's pretty precise, good bioavailability. We should be doing this more. You can also give multiple injections if you want to titrate the dose differently. But anyway, we should be doing that. We should be offering group work, group ketamine sessions when that's clinically indicated or clinically possible. I could go on for an hour just about that one point. I'm not going to do that now, but we should be looking at that possibility to increase accessibility. 2 other things, we need to be training more providers. We need to have more providers, particularly psychologically minded providers and psychedelic friendly providers who know how to use this tool in different ways. That will improve accessibility. And finally, we need to be working together on multi-site data collection, ultimately with an eye toward FDA approval of generic ketamine for a psychiatric indication. And that's going to open the door to broad coverage by medical insurance for this treatment. So that's where we need to go, and we're going to need to work together in order to make that happen. Anyway, I hope I have piqued your interest in this fascinating topic. I encourage you to take a training if you'd like to work with this tool in your clinical practice. You can find a list of trainings on my website. And in your training in particular, a couple of things that are really important to know about. You would want to know more about the pharmacology of ketamine, the clinical indications of ketamine, including the established ones that I just named. And then there is a number of investigational ones where the data is less robust, but we're looking at it. And of course, the inclusion and exclusion criteria for treatment, you would want to know that before using this tool. You would want to have a good working knowledge of the chemical mitigators and various drug interactions. You would want to know about the side effects, how to assess them and how to treat them. There are minor and major side effects to this in all medication. We want to be really thoughtful about the addiction potential here. The legal status of ketamine is quite nuanced, and so you want to make sure that you clearly understand the role of the DEA and the state board with respect to what is legally defensible for the use of clinical ketamine. And so again, you can find some trainings on my website. They're not my trainings, rather, but trainings that I'd like to recommend. Also, I hope that more people will get involved in the ketamine research. Ketamine is available right now without a lot of bureaucratic red tape for certain indications, and we could be using it, we should be using it to study altered states of consciousness and mystical and transpersonal experience. So I hope that some folks will hear this talk and be excited about starting new research projects. Anyway, to end, let me leave you with some resources. Again, you can find lots of free information on my website. My website is kriyainstitute.com, KRIYA, kriyainstitute.com. You can find free articles and books, videos and podcasts, my favorite music for psychedelic ketamine journeys. There's a bunch of free resources, especially for clinicians. There's a list of other events where I'll be speaking, and also you can find my email address on my website. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this talk. I look forward to meeting you in the future.